Good morning, everyone. So, we come here and a new video about uh, Israel and Gaza wars, how this war is going, and different persons have a different opinions. But I have a very good clips in the Judging Freedom podcast on by Professor John mearsheimer about how Israel operates in this Gaza wars and one thinks what is the two-state solution and what's the two-state solutions of actually looks like and what's the negotiations for the two-state solutions are happening and another things I will say the how the Israel is preparing to war with Hezbollah and these types of beautifully analyzed about this wars by the Professor John mearsheimer is discussed in this podcast. So let us look how this podcast is ongoing.
States Navy there. We don't have an aircraft carrier to go there. The only three aircraft carriers that work are either in the Red Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean. Why are we in the South China Sea?
Well, we've been in the South China Sea for a long time. It goes back to World War II, and then we were there during the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended, we stayed in East Asia just like we stayed in Europe. And as you know, if anything, we increased the size of our footprint around the world after the Cold War ended. So we were not going to leave the South China Sea or East Asia more generally. And then with the rise of China, the United States became focused on containing China. And as we've talked about before on the show, there's this whole question of whether the United States should defend Taiwan. And there's also the question of whether or not the United States should defend the South China Sea for the purposes of containing China. And it seems to me that it's quite clear that whether you're talking about the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or in the future, another Trump administration or Harris administration, we are not going to go home and we're going to remain in the South China Sea. We're going to remain committed to making sure that it is an international body of water. And we're going to remain committed to the Philippines. And all of this just tells you that this is a dangerous situation.
Who has the better Navy, China or the U.S.?
I think that the United States clearly has a better Navy, but what you want to remember is that China is effectively a giant aircraft carrier. So if a war were to break out over Taiwan or over the South China Sea or over the East China Sea, the United States and the Chinese were to start shooting at each other, it wouldn't simply be the navies, the ships that were in the water that mattered. In fact, one could argue that all of the land-based aircraft and all of the land-based missiles inside of China would be of tremendous advantage to the Chinese in a conflict against us.
Switching gears to Israel, what is the, if there is one, greatest or worst, however you want to characterize it, mistake that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made throughout this entire Gaza Hezbollah event? You can go back to before October 7th if you feel you need to answer that.
Well, the first problem he made, the first mistake he made was long ago when he rejected a two-state solution and he decided that he was going to create a greater Israel that would effectively be an apartheid state. That was a huge blunder. Then he made a huge blunder in not foreseeing what happened on October 7th. The buck stops with him. He was the prime minister of Israel, and he is ultimately responsible for the disaster that befell Israel on October 7th. Then, once the war began, once Israel turned the dogs loose in Gaza, he made another huge mistake because what he ended up doing was not only trying to defeat Hamas decisively, which was impossible to do, but he ended up trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza, which took him down the road to genocide. And in the end, the Israelis have murdered huge numbers of Palestinian civilians, and they have not defeated Hamas. What he should have done if he was smart, and I'm talking about what he should have done from his own perspective, is he should have just said, we made a fundamental mistake on October 7th. We were unprepared. We got caught with our pants down. And what we're going to do is we're going to build the defenses around Gaza to the point where Hamas can never do that again. And we are going to go from there. And we're not going to go to war inside of Gaza. We're not going to try to reconquer Gaza or decisively defeat Hamas, because that's not possible. But he didn't do that. He didn't, come back basically to a situation where Israel maintained Gaza as a giant open air prison, which is what he should have done. Again, I want to be clear. My argument is that long ago he should have moved towards a two-state solution, given the Palestinians a state of their own. But after that, it was a foolish move to go to war inside of Gaza, and he's stuck there now.
Well, you're addressing the two-state solution. Hillary Rodham Clinton is out with a new book. It's out today, or at least the advanced galleys are out today. And among many other things in there, she claims that in the year 2000, her husband offered a two-state solution proposal to Ehud Barak, the former chief of staff of the IDF and then the prime minister, a political liberal by Israeli standards. And he accepted it, but Yasser Arafat would not. She blames Arafat for everything that happened since then, and said that if he had accepted her husband's proposal, the Palestinians, instead of having lost what she says is 41,000 people, we all know the number is multiples of that greater, would be celebrating their 23rd anniversary as a sovereign country. Have you ever heard such a claim?
Oh, sure. Bill Clinton himself made this claim after the Camp David negotiations failed in 2000. Let me give you a little background on this case. Bill Clinton was in his last year in the White House. This is 2000. And he was deeply committed to creating some sort of peaceful agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which in his mind meant a two-state solution. So I think there's no question that Clinton's heart was in the right place. And he pushed both Barak and Arafat to meet at Camp David in the summer of 2000. Now, Arafat said, I don't want to meet. Arafat said, we have not done enough preliminary legwork to produce a meaningful agreement. Clinton put enormous pressure on Arafat to come. Arafat said, I'll go to Camp David, but I want to be clear that I don't think this is going to work out. And if it doesn't work out, I don't want you to blame me. In other words, I don't want you to stab me in the back. So they went to Camp David. They negotiated. It was a very dysfunctional negotiating process.
Did Clinton agree not to stab him in the back?
Yes, he did. Of course he did. And of course, the negotiations failed, right? They did not reach an agreement. The idea that there was an agreement that Clinton had crafted, a final agreement, it was presented to Barak, Ehud Barak, and he accepted it, and Arafat rejected it, is simply not true. And in fact, after Camp David failed, the two sides continued to negotiate because there was a possibility of a deal. There's no question about that. But there was no deal reached at Camp David. Camp David broke up. And of course, Bill Clinton stabbed Arafat in the back. He blamed Arafat for the failure. And the story that Hillary is now telling is the story that Bill told after Camp David failed. And Arafat, who foolishly went to Camp David believing that Clinton would be true to his word, ended up being the bad guy. And if you talk to most supporters of Israel in the United States today, they'll tell you that story every time. It's a story that's constantly repeated. And Hillary now repeating it will just give more ammunition to Israel's supporters to make the argument that we'd all be living happily ever after had it not been for Arafat, which is another way of saying if it hadn't been for those evil Palestinians.
Over the weekend, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced publicly that he instructed the IDF to prepare for an invasion of Lebanon. This is the third time he's made such an announcement? Do you think he's serious? And why would he make this announcement publicly unless it's, to quote Sir Peter, just for the narrative?
I don't know what he's thinking here. I really don't. I mean, if the Israelis go after Lebanon, they can do it in one of two ways. One is they can invade with ground forces, and two, they can bomb Hezbollah from the air. When you listen to Netanyahu talk and you listen to many Israelis talk, it sounds like they're going to go in there with ground forces. I find it hard to believe that they would countenance doing that. First of all, their army is in terrible shape, in large part because of all the wear and tear from what's been going on in Gaza since last October. They're having a huge problem with reservists, and reservists comprise more than half of the IDF forces. Furthermore, if you go into southern Lebanon and you tangle with Hezbollah, you're going into a hornet's nest. It's not like this is going to be an easy victory. This is not going to be like the Six-Day War in 1967. You want to remember the Israelis went into southern Lebanon to tangle with Hezbollah in 2006, and they basically lost. They came out with their tail between their legs. So with an army that's in bad shape and a Hezbollah fighting force that's more effective today than it was in 2006, I want to know how the Israelis are going to go in there and solve the problem. The United States is in the area, and one might argue the United States can help the Israelis, but are we going to send in ground forces? I find that hard to imagine. I guess we could help the Israelis bomb Hezbollah, but I'm not sure the Israelis need that much help bombing Hezbollah. And if the Israelis and the Americans begin to bomb Hezbollah, I think Hezbollah is going to launch a huge chunk of those 150,000 plus rockets and missiles that it has at Israel. I'm not sure this is good for Israel. I'm not sure that this is the way Israel should proceed. What the Israelis should do is they should agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, because once they agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, that will end the war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in this war or in this shooting match with Israel because of what's going on in Gaza. So let's get a ceasefire in Gaza, and then you don't have the Hezbollah problem anymore. And all of those, I would guess 60, 70,000 Israelis who live in the north of Israel normally, but are now displaced, can go back home. But of course, Netanyahu won't agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And the end result is the shooting match between Hezbollah on one side and Israel on the other shows no signs of ending.
Do you think we're comfortable in saying that he wouldn't actually pull the trigger, so to speak, and dispatch them, whether by land or air, into Lebanon without knowing the exact nature of support that he has from the United States? I mean, the general, the four-star, name escaping me, in charge of CENTCOM, the military's phrase, you know this from your military experience, for Central Europe, but it includes the Middle East, just spent a week in Tel Aviv.
He knows we'll support him no matter what. I mean, Netanyahu basically thinks that he owns us. He gets whatever he wants. You saw what happened when he went before Congress.
Oh, yes.
He doesn't worry about American support. This is not a serious issue. If Iran attacks, we're all waiting for the big Iranian attack. If Iran attacks Israel, the United States, this is why we have all those military assets in the theater, is going to help the Israelis fend off the Iranian attack. We help the Israelis at every turn. And the Biden administration is certainly not going to hesitate to help Israel.
I just have another question to ask you about the South China Sea and the presence of American ships there.